This week on the 302, we talk to state and local leaders about COVID-19, where we've been, where we want to be, and the tools we need to get there. Grab a pen and paper. The 302 is headed your way. Hey 302, we are talking about ways we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we thought we'd go to the source in Wilmington, that is Mayor Mike Krzycki. Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Katrina.
So let's talk a little bit about, we're slowly starting to reopen. We're trying to get back to some sense of normalcy. What does that mean for the city of Wilmington?
I don't know if it's all that different, frankly, than it is in a lot of places. I think everybody's just trying to find a new, comfortable normal. We all know that there are different rules, but we're still not comfortable with them. So our building is half empty. We still have a lot of people at home, and we feel more comfortable with them at home and work at home. And I think they feel the same way. You know, we're still trying to get used to how many people can get on the elevator, what kind of jobs we want our employees to be doing that perhaps put them in greater exposure to COVID. So we're all trying to improve every day. I think the big challenge for us and everybody across the country is what's going to happen in another month or so when the kids go back to school. We have to have conviction that what we're doing is the best choice for all of our kids and the teachers and everybody who works with our students. So to me, that's a big part of this process that's going on everywhere. And in a sense, which kind of begs the question of how you're going to get there, I think all of those things work fine when you and your particular locale have slowed the spread to the point where being in contact with others is a much safer proposition.
Now, I know that the work to get there, you have praised your city employees and the folks that you've been working with, saying that, you know, they're excellent and they're efficient in their endeavors. But what does this slowdown, you know, it's hitting businesses, but it's also hitting the city. What does this mean for the operation of the city in terms of revenues and things like that? And is there a plan? Are you working on a plan to try to maybe a federal grant or state grant or something to help ease that pain?
Okay. The state grants, we're not eligible for reduced revenue. What we are eligible for are expenses that generally relate to the COVID experience. So there are some things that don't make much more sense being eligible than others, but we're just taking advantage of everything that we can get reimbursed for to help us with our budget constraints. We projected a $13 million reduction in revenue last year. That's a big number for us. We got almost $170 million budget. So when 8% of it's gone, that's a pretty big number. And frankly, we're hoping to hold that number. We meet weekly on revenue projections, and so it's very likely that we're not going to make that.
How are businesses faring now? Are they starting to reopen, and what has been your counsel for them?
They're reopening, but they're struggling, as you can imagine. Restaurants that did 6 million plus a year ago will struggle to do less than half that. And so it means layoffs. It means deferred payments that they otherwise could schedule. It's just putting an enormous amount of stress on our restaurants. The Grand Opera House is it's our cultural icon down here. They just laid off their whole staff for the year. They just closed down for a year and laid off a significant portion of their staff. Well, they're all people who live in the city and pay rent and patronize restaurants and bars. And they're not going to be able to do that. They're going to be living on unemployment checks. So this is a profound shock that we all have to deal with. We're doing our very best. dealing with our own problems, but also trying to support our businesses as well, because we recognize in the long run they're the lifeblood of the city.
And one of the things that you've been quoted as saying many times is we're all in this together. And that certainly is the case in Wilmington and communities across the country, the nation, and the world as a whole. But can you talk a little bit about some of the conversations that are starting, when we get through this, how we're going to rebuild and be a bigger, better version of ourselves?
Yes. So starting with what you started with, we're all in this together. I think everybody says it, not everybody means it. And so, I think this is a time where I think we have to reevaluate all the economic and social systems in our country and start thinking about how we extend ourselves to help people who obviously during periods like this need someone to help them. And so that's kind of an overall thematic view that I have of all of this, that we owe it to each other to try to extend a helping hand. The what we want to do when we come out on the other side of this is be what I've always called a just city, where people in every corner of the city feel that the doors of prosperity are open for them as well. It's harder. It's harder when you've got economic contraction than when you've got economic expansion. But I think what we have to be doing is thinking how we prioritize the allocation of our resources to people who've been marginalized for the longest time. So I think when we come out on the other side of this, I want our city to be a better moral and ethical city, so that we have our priorities in a different place than I think what we've done in the past. And I believe we have enough of an economic pulse here in this city that if we marry those strong economic fundamentals with a kind of a repurposing of our priorities, I think we're going to be in great shape.
Now, the last thing I just want to touch on briefly is that anything that the city does in terms of coordinating aid for folks or programs or testing for COVID, you have a special section on your website.
We'll refer to folks to Newcastle County, which is primarily responsible for the COVID response as dictated by the federal government, and our Health and Social Services Department, which is a state response. But we all have links to those places where people can access the services they need.
Excellent. Mayor Mike Krzyzewski, thank you so much for spending time with us, and we'll talk to you soon.
Sure, Jackie.
All right. We'll be right back.
John Schoonover here at Schoonover Studios. Happy birthday, 302.
Welcome back. We're talking to our government and community leaders about what's being done for the pandemic in terms of the community and the state. Right now, we're joined by Lieutenant Governor Bethany Hall Long. And Lieutenant Governor, you are part of the Pandemic Resurgence Advisory Committee. Can you tell me a little bit about what that is and what they do?
Absolutely. And it's always great. Thank you so much for having us back on 302. I love it. And thank you for getting the word out. The Pandemic Advisory Resurgence Committee, nicknamed the acronym PRAC, really has as its mission, Governor Carney pulled us together with a group of community-based leaders and experts around three buckets: one, business, and two, health, and three, equity. Obviously, someone who is a professor of nursing prioritizes, as we did in our last conversation, having a healthy community. You cannot have a healthy economy, without a healthy community. So healthy community first, but we also have to have equity, particularly among our communities at higher risk, socioeconomic status, maybe some communities of different language barriers, communities of color. We have to make sure there's equity. And if we're successful in those, businesses are also successful. And so our governor pulled together a group of leaders. We are lucky, really lucky in Delaware to have some forward-thinking individuals. The State Chamber Representative Katie Wilkinson chairs the committee around business, working with some of our state and nonprofits, as well as agency employees and the governor's office staff and my staff. Our health committee is chaired by our healthcare commission leader, Dr. Nancy Phan, practicing physician. And we also have our equity committee, which is chaired by Eugene Young, with the Metropolitan Urban League in Wilmington, and many members of different communities who want to have a voice at the table and should have a voice at the table. We don't want to repeat what didn't work over March to this point, and that's the goal. The Pandemic Resurgence Committee wants to build on what's working, what's the best and brightest ideas, and let's not repeat any areas that we had limitations. So we're hopeful. We're going to be giving our governor an interim draft, or actually not a draft, but an interim report next week. We've been working with Boston Consulting Group. They've been working with many other states as well as global leaders. So we are really trying hard to bring the best plan with Delaware to the governor, and a final report in September.
Now, I know that this is probably going to be a very in-depth report, but can you briefly tell us some of the things that maybe we wouldn't know that would be contained in the report? You mentioned that some of the communities, minority communities, are hit harder by COVID. Is there something that you can tell us about that?
Yes, communities of color, or communities with socioeconomic status issues, or communities that have challenges in addition to the normal of the pandemic, whether it be housing, transportation, things that make it harder to social isolate and to do those important things that we've been doing, wearing our masks and 6 feet distancing and not being in confined quarters. We know in our state, both here in the city as well as in the southern part of our state, that our Latino community in particular was hit very hard with our infectivity rate. So we're coming out with some objectives that look at short-term, that look at long-term initiatives. We also are integrating things that have worked well. I'm a real biased person for telehealth. I've been a real champion. When I was in the Senate, worked hard with our members of the General Assembly. Folks probably weren't thinking that we're going to talk about broadband. In this report, we are going to be talking about broadband. In particular, it's an area that's a challenge for our rural communities, but also some of our hard to reach communities and our communities of color. So that's probably just one example of one that just jumps to mind that folks probably aren't thinking about, but it makes a huge difference if you and I can pick up the phone and talk to our doctor, talk to a psychiatrist, keep our health, cardiovascular health, while we are in these situations. So we've got to do things differently, but build on what worked, and telehealth has worked. And that's one that just jumped right out at me.
Mm-hmm. So how have we been doing? I know that the state has had daily and weekly briefings. The various municipalities have done everything they can to communicate, wear a mask, wash your hands, social distance, that kind of thing. How are we doing so far ahead of any resurgence?
Again, thanks to the partnerships. This is not one size fits all. There is not a pandemic playbook, but there is something we can do together, and that is to work with our municipal leaders, with our faith-based leaders, with our nonprofits to stay ahead. I know that our governor, working with our leaders in public health, Dr. Rattay and Edema, AJ Shaw, have worked really hard with our hospital systems in particular to lower our hospital rate, to keep those who are critically ill out of our ICUs. But we're only going to do it with all hands on deck with the preventative. And so overall, we have done well on the Eastern Coast. We did partner with the PAC, with the other states. We have more to do. We can't let the foot up off the pedal. And I encourage your viewing and listening audiences to go to our dashboard, which is a fancy term, folks, for saying go to a place where you can find out how the state's doing. And if you go to de.gov/coronavirus, you can actually pull up, using the Department of Health and Social Services, My Healthy Communities, your zip code. And you can actually see some of the data into the zip code, how you're doing. So again, with our 13,000 infected individuals, there's hope in that we are able to test. I'm so proud of the players in our state, our hospital systems, our State Department of Health and Social Services, Department of Substance Abuse and Mental Health, and DEMA. We have had excellent drive-through services, and thanks to great volunteers, my colleague, my friend from Behavioral Health Consortium, Dr. Gibney, who dons on her suit, who goes out, does the COVID testing in the city of Wilmington, up and down the state with the University of Delaware St. Francis van. I can't thank them enough. If you look at the other states in the media, you'll see people waiting in line for 14 hours. We have done a better job. We've not been perfect. We have a lot of room to go with testing and contact tracing, but we're working hard at that.
Alrighty, we're talking about efforts, state efforts during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to talk about education when we return. We're talking to Lieutenant Governor Bethany Hall-Long. We'll be right back.
My name is Tia Santana. I'm a ceramics instructor at the Center for Creative Arts, and we're getting fired up for the 302.
Welcome back. We're talking to Lieutenant Governor Bethany Hall-Long about COVID-19 efforts in the state of Delaware. Now, Lieutenant Governor, the governor recently laid out a plan to have the kids go back to school. I know you are an expert in the field of higher education. Let's talk about how things are going to go in the fall right now as it stands.
As a mom who had a child who was in public school, private school, all levels of education, and as a professor at the University of Delaware, nothing more important than balancing quality, safe education, right? Quality and safety. And to our governor's credit, he had formed a separate task force. I know we talked earlier about the Pandemic Resurgence Advisory Committee that was looking at equity, health, and business. There was another task force that has recently centered suggestions for our 19 public school districts, where the local decisions will be ultimately made. They put together a draft plan, presented it to our Secretary of Education, Secretary Bunting. And if individuals would like to see that, they can certainly visit the governor's website, de.gov/to coronavirus. The plans are there, and to the Department of Ed. And what you'll see really lays out based on how well we do in our community. If the infectivity rate is low, there's a green light plan, then there's a yellow light, and then a red light. And the red light would be all online for our children. And the yellow light's caution, maybe a little hybrid. Maybe certain grade levels would go back, maybe some staggering on days, maybe certain classes would be all online. Again, I was not part of that initial task force, but I can tell you it fits nicely into the work that we're doing with the PRAC, because it will call for common sense things like testing of teachers. It would call for different mechanisms to protect our community. So with the education, you have a choice, and it will come down to ultimately the local school districts basing on how our infectivity data are here in the community. And when I get a call from someone who says, what's going to happen, I don't have that magic number, but as someone who is a mom and understands, I think it's important that we in Delaware as families and parents have choices that we can in place. Being prepared at any point in time. Should the schools fully reopen, if the local school district decides that, then you would need to be prepared that at some point it may be a totally online. I like the fact that our higher education institutions, where I actually have my other practice hat, have looked at this very closely individually. We have a different program set up through Delaware Technical Community College versus Delaware State versus the University of Delaware, our three public major flagship institutions in our state. They're looking at having massive testing at the University of Delaware, right? They're not going to bring everybody back. We're going to have a hybrid. If you have a large class, it's going to be smaller. So putting in those measures, Del Tech looking at online. So again, I think it's so important that families, along with our education leaders, make those decisions. based upon the infectivity rate that we see in a couple of weeks from now or a month from now.
It sounds like state, local, educational, everybody is on the same page. And you mentioned telehealth. It seems like it's tele everything these days.
Yes.
And that's, I think,
Today.
exactly. And I think that's one of the strengths that has come out of this entire thing. Just some final thoughts before we go. Is there anything that you think folks at home should know, about the pandemic moving forward?
I think that we should all learn together what has worked well for us and build on that. I really do worry some about our seniors and others who are socially isolated. I've had the wonderful experience every other week of talking with faith-based leaders in the state, as well as leaders from our Latino community and our African American community, where we really want to make sure individuals are getting services. But to all of our state, please turn to our 211 if you are struggling. We have seen an uptick in our overdose death rate, a number of individuals seeking counseling, which is good. It is okay not to be okay now. And so I always want to emphasize that, to turn to Help Is Here in Delaware and to continue doing what we're doing. We will get through this, and there will be some silver linings that come of this. And I just thank individuals and encourage them to give us feedback with our Pandemic Resurgence Committee. Visit de.gov/PrAC. We have a public schedule there. Again, we welcome ideas. And so thank you for having me here. And thank you for reiterating those things that we can do to keep ourselves well.
Well, thank you, Lieutenant Governor, for joining us. It always is a pleasure to have you on the show, and hopefully we will see you again really
soon, and maybe in person soon.
That's right.
All right, thank you.
We'll be right back. That'll do it for this week's episode. Until next time, I'm Jackie Ferris. Stay safe and healthy in the 302.